In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Garland, Texas was a place that seemed to exist just outside the rapid pace of change sweeping across America. Located northeast of Dallas, Garland was a middle-class suburb, nestled in the growing sprawl of the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex, but it maintained a sense of close-knit charm. Neighbors knew one another. Children played freely in the streets. The days often ended with the hum of cicadas and the flickering of porch lights. It was the kind of place where families planted deep roots, churches played a central role in the community, and people left their doors unlocked at night. There was a trust that surrounded everything, a quiet confidence that this town was safe, that the horrors of the outside world wouldn't come knocking. Teenagers in Garland during that era experienced a blend of innocence and budding independence. There were high school football games under the lights, Saturday night trips to the local roller rink, and weekends spent at Garland Road Drive-In Theater. The soundtrack of their youth was shaped by the voices of Fleetwood Mac, Blondie, and REO Speedwagon drifting from car radios. It was a simpler time, one without smartphones or constant digital connection, where relationships were forged face-to-face and handwritten notes passed in class still carried weight. For young girls, it was a world filled with dreams, of growing up to be something special, of making a mark. Shelley Nance was one of those girls. A 17-year-old high school student, Shelley was full of life, ambition, and an unmistakable kindness that made her stand out. She was the youngest of 4 siblings and adored by her family. Her father, a hardworking man, and her mother, known for her gentle warmth, raised their children with strong values and a clear sense of right and wrong. Shelley had dreams that reached far beyond the edges of Garland. She wanted to become a nurse, not just for the job security or prestige, but because she genuinely wanted to help people. That desire to care for others radiated in everything she did. Those who knew Shelley described her as bright, funny, and endlessly compassionate. She had a natural way of putting others at ease. Teachers noticed her diligence and curiosity, while classmates were drawn to her bubbly personality. She wasn't one to cause drama or chase popularity. Instead, she found joy in the simple things. Late-night phone calls with friends, flipping through fashion magazines, or walking her dog in the neighborhood park. Her laugh was infectious, her smile unforgettable. She embodied a certain kind of youthful hope, one that made it easy to believe that the world could be a good place. Shelley's day-to-day life was filled with the familiar rhythms of a small-town teenager. She attended Garland High School, where she performed well academically and stayed active in extracurriculars. After school, she often babysat for neighborhood families to earn extra money. Babysitting came naturally to her. Children adored her and parents trusted her without question. She also worked a part-time job at a local store, showing the kind of responsibility that belied her years. At home, she helped her mother with household chores, confided in her older siblings, and dreamed aloud about the life she was building. Her room was filled with books and keepsakes, photos of her friends taped to her mirror, and a growing collection of nursing brochures and college pamphlets. The safety Shelley and her peers felt was almost taken for granted. It was a time before true crime documentaries filled evening programming, before parents were taught to fear the worst when their child was late coming home. In Garland, crimes of any serious nature were rare, and violent crimes against young girls almost unheard of. The very idea that someone could harm a 17-year-old girl in her own neighborhood was inconceivable. And so, Shelley lived freely. She trusted her community, believed in its goodness, and moved through it with a sense of ease that reflected the world around her. But even in the safest towns, even in the most ordinary neighborhoods, darkness can linger unseen. What made Shelley's story so devastating wasn't just the brutality of what happened to her. It was that someone like her, in a place like Garland, could be taken so violently and so senselessly. Her death would go on to shatter not only her family, but the collective sense of security that the town had clung to for generations. Before that night, Garland was a place where tragedy felt like a distant thing, something that happened in big cities or on the evening news. But after Shelley Nance, everything changed. Yet before that tragic turning point, Shelley was simply a teenage girl full of promise. Her life was a quiet, beautiful testament to how one person can light up a community, how the smallest acts of kindness can leave lasting impressions, and how the dreams of a 17-year-old girl can echo long after she is gone. Her story begins not with the horror that would later define it, but with the light she brought into the world every single day she was alive. It was a warm summer evening in Garland, Texas on July 7, 1980. The kind of evening that hummed with the usual quiet of suburban life, a peace that felt eternal to the families who called the town home. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky shifted into that soft in-between hue of twilight and darkness, 17-year-old Shelley Nance was settling in for the evening. She had taken a babysitting job at a house on Meadowview Drive. The couple she was sitting for trusted her completely. Shelley was known for being reliable, responsible, and mature beyond her years. She had babysat for their children before, and she took her role seriously. That evening, like so many others, she was focused on making a little extra money and perhaps catching up on a book while the kids were asleep. Shelley's day had started off like any other. She had eaten breakfast at home, exchanged laughter with her siblings, and helped her mother tidy the kitchen before heading out. She wore her signature soft smile that never quite faded, the kind of expression that gave people the impression she was always listening, always caring. In the days leading up to July 7th, Shelley had been making plans for her future. She had recently told her friends she wanted to become a nurse, drawn to the profession by a deep desire to help others. She had applied to colleges and was waiting to hear back, quietly excited about the life that stretched ahead of her. On that Monday night, everything seemed ordinary. Shelley arrived at the Meadowview Drive home around 6:30 p.m. The children were already finishing dinner, and the parents were running a little behind. Shelley chatted with them briefly before they left. They reminded her to call if anything came up and left a number on the fridge. It wasn't uncommon for teens to babysit in Garland. The town still clung to a sense of innocence, of comfort in the known. That evening felt like any other, and perhaps that was why the horror of what happened would later shake the town to its core. The hours that followed remained clouded in mystery. At some point after the children were asleep and before the parents returned home, Shelley encountered someone inside the house. Whether she knew them or whether they were a stranger remains a question that has haunted the investigation for decades. What is known is that Shelley was attacked in the very house where she was trusted to protect others. She was stabbed multiple times in what authorities would later describe as a frenzied and brutal assault. There were signs of a struggle, furniture slightly out of place, small items knocked over, and yet the crime scene suggested a terrifying level of sudden violence. The children, miraculously, were unharmed and remained asleep in their rooms during the attack. That detail would become one of the most chilling parts of the story, how someone could carry out such violence mere feet away from sleeping children. When the parents returned home just after midnight, they found Shelley's body. At first, there was confusion. They called her name. There was no answer. Then came panic, followed by the sickening realization that something had gone terribly wrong. The 911 call came shortly after, and police and paramedics were on the scene within minutes. Word traveled fast in Garland. The Nance family was alerted during the early morning hours. Shelley's parents were devastated, their grief bottomless and instant. Her siblings were too young to fully grasp what had happened but old enough to feel the shift in the house, the aching silence, the cold absence that followed when someone so central is suddenly gone. Police immediately secured the scene. The house was combed for evidence, and neighbors were questioned. No one had seen anything. No one had heard a scream. That was perhaps the most terrifying part, how something so violent could happen so quietly. The media caught wind of the murder quickly. Reporters showed up near the home the next morning, and local headlines ran stories about the babysitter murder that had shattered the peace of suburban Garland. Parents held their children tighter. Neighbors began locking doors that had always been left open. And across town, the Nance family tried to understand how their daughter, so full of life, so careful, so kind, could have met such a horrific end. In a single night, the illusion of safety was gone, and Garland would never be the same. In the hours following the discovery of Shelley's body, Garland police launched a full-scale investigation. The crime had all the elements of a sensational tragedy: a young, beloved girl murdered in a quiet neighborhood while watching over children. But as quickly as the investigation began, detectives realized they were walking into a storm of uncertainty. There were no eyewitnesses. The children were too young to recall anything useful, and the forensic technology of the time was rudimentary by today's standards. DNA analysis was not yet a tool investigators could rely on, and much of the evidence collected at the scene would later prove inconclusive. The first step was narrowing down a suspect list, and that process would prove frustratingly complex. Shelley's personal life was scrutinized. Her family, friends, classmates, and even former babysitting clients were all questioned. Was it someone she knew? Was it a random intruder? Theories began to swirl, both within the police department and among the townspeople. Some believed Shelley had been targeted, perhaps stalked. Others feared a predator had chosen her at random. The absence of clear evidence meant that anything was possible, and that was perhaps the most frightening reality of all. Detectives combed through Shelley's phone records and spoke with anyone who might have seen her that day. They examined her route to the babysitting job, tried to determine if anyone had followed her, and interviewed neighbors along Meadowview Drive. But the neighborhood had been quiet. No strange cars were seen, no unfamiliar faces noted. There was no sign of forced entry, leading investigators to believe Shelley may have let her killer in willingly. That idea opened up a painful line of inquiry. Who would Shelley have trusted enough to let inside? Meanwhile, the Nance family was left in emotional limbo. The funeral came quickly, and with it came waves of condolences from neighbors, friends, classmates, and even strangers. But there were no answers. No arrests. No closure. Shelley's parents struggled to function in the weeks that followed. Her room was left untouched. Her clothes remained folded in drawers. Her dreams of nursing school, her high school diploma, and the fragments of her young life stood still in time. Her younger siblings tried to process the change through drawings, questions, and nightmares. And in the middle of it all, reporters continued to chase leads, most of them dead ends. In the months that followed, the case began to cool. Without a confession or physical evidence that pointed definitively to one suspect, investigators found themselves stuck. They followed up on tips, revisited interviews, and re-examined evidence, but the picture remained incomplete. Meanwhile, fear settled over Garland like a fog. Teenagers were no longer allowed to babysit alone. Parents created informal neighborhood watches. The idea that someone capable of such a horrific act could be living among them without consequence gnawed at everyone. Rumors began to fill the vacuum left by official information. Some claimed the killer was someone Shelley had dated. Others whispered that it was a stranger who had watched her from afar. Theories spread, each more chilling than the last. Still, through it all, the Nance family held on to hope. They cooperated with the police, did interviews with the press, and begged the public for information. But as the seasons changed and a year passed, that hope began to dim. Shelley's case was no longer on the front page. New crimes and new headlines took its place. The police department still had the case open, but with fewer leads and dwindling attention, the momentum slowed. The Nance family continued to live in the same home, surrounded by memories and haunted by the lack of justice. They did their best to move forward, but every holiday, every birthday, was a reminder of what was stolen. For the people of Garland, the murder of Shelley Nance remained a quiet trauma. It changed how people lived, how they trusted, and how they saw their town. But as time passed, so too did the urgency around solving her case, at least in the eyes of the public. Behind the scenes, though, investigators would revisit the case in later years. New detectives would inherit the cold file, new technologies would be considered, and the memory of Shelley Nance would never fully disappear. But in 1980, as the investigation stalled and answers remained elusive, the sense of injustice was overwhelming, and for a grieving family, it felt like time itself had betrayed them. Years passed, then decades. As the 1980s faded into the 1990s and the new millennium approached, Shelley Nance's murder remained unsolved. For the Garland community, the horror that once shook the town began to settle into the background, becoming an uncomfortable piece of its past, never forgotten, but rarely spoken aloud. Yet for Shelley's family, time did not dull the pain. Her absence was woven into every season, every milestone. Her father, in particular, carried the weight of her loss like a permanent shadow. He became a quiet but persistent voice for justice, never giving up hope that someone, someday, would come forward or that the case would be reopened with new eyes. The years were not kind to the investigation. In the 1980s and 1990s, forensic science lacked the precision it would later gain. Evidence collected from the scene, blood, fingerprints, fibers, was stored away, but much of it could not be fully utilized with the tools of the time. Cold cases rarely received dedicated attention, and Shelley's file sat in storage, growing older with each passing year. Detectives retired, and memories faded. For the Nance family, the silence from the police and the community became its own form of torment. As the world moved on, they remained suspended in grief and uncertainty, haunted by the mystery of Shelley's final moments and the knowledge that her killer had never been brought to justice. Despite the passage of time, Shelley's name never disappeared completely. Her story was sometimes brought up in local papers, her photograph used as a symbol of unsolved tragedies. But real progress was elusive. The truth was, for many years, no one knew who had taken Shelley's life or why. And as birthdays and anniversaries passed in quiet remembrance, the question that haunted her family most remained painfully unanswered. Would they ever know? It wasn't until the early 2000s that hope was rekindled. Advances in DNA technology were transforming cold case investigations across the country, and Garland's department began revisiting their oldest unsolved murders. Shelley's case stood out, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because key evidence had been carefully preserved. Among those items was something seemingly ordinary, a beer can found at the scene, which at the time had been overlooked as just another discarded object in the house. But new forensic tools made it possible to extract DNA from that can, along with other small pieces of evidence that had once been considered unusable. Cold case detectives began to re-examine Shelley's file with fresh eyes. They pored over old witness statements, reanalyzed the crime scene photos, and compared their findings with updated databases. And then they got a match. The DNA from the beer can belong to Glen McCurley, a man who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life just miles away. McCurley had even been questioned in the original investigation, but back in 1980, there was nothing solid to tie him to the crime. Now the science said otherwise. With this breakthrough, detectives built their case carefully. They surveilled McCurley, tracked his routines, and eventually collected additional DNA samples to confirm the match. When confronted, he initially denied any involvement, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Faced with irrefutable proof and persistent questioning, McCurley eventually confessed to killing Shelley Nance, decades after he had committed the crime and lived under the assumption that he had gotten away with it. Justice had finally arrived, not with fanfare but with the quiet power of persistence and science. A single beer can and a few overlooked pieces of evidence, long buried in a file box, had spoken louder than decades of silence. For Shelley's family, the confession brought a measure of closure, but also the reminder of all they had lost. After 40 years, they finally had answers. And while the pain never fully faded, the long shadow of her murder was at last met with a name, a face, and the truth they had waited so long to hear. By 2021, 4 decades after the brutal murder of 17-year-old Shelley Nance in Garland, Texas, the wheels of justice finally began turning in earnest. Glen McCurley had been arrested and charged with capital murder after DNA evidence linked him to the crime that had haunted a family and chilled a community since the summer of 1980. The arrest was monumental. It had taken the combination of tenacious detectives, preserved evidence, and scientific advancement to uncover what had remained hidden for so long. But even with the breakthrough, there remained the final and perhaps most emotionally difficult chapter, the trial. McCurley, now in his late 70s, had spent most of his adult life living under the radar. To many who knew him, He was a quiet, unremarkable man, someone who blended into the ordinary fabric of the Garland area. Neighbors had described him as polite, if distant. He had married, raised a family, and worked various blue-collar jobs. He did not have a long criminal record, nor did he fit the typical image of a violent predator. That very normalcy, the fact that he had lived freely and unobstructed for 40 years, made the reality even more difficult for Shelley's family to digest. The idea that he had gone on with life while their daughter and sister had not, it was a cruel twist that made the pursuit of justice feel both righteous and devastating. As the trial date approached, anticipation and anxiety spread through the Nance family and the community. For Shelley's loved ones, the courtroom would be a place of reckoning, not just for the man accused, but for the decades of unanswered questions, unhealed wounds, and long-standing grief. The prosecution prepared to present their case meticulously. They would highlight the forensic evidence that tied McCurley to the scene, including the DNA recovered from a Coors beer can left inside the home where Shelley was murdered. They would recount the details of his original alibi in 1980, which had since crumbled under the weight of new evidence. They would play recordings of his interviews with police, including the moment when, after hours of evasion, he finally admitted to killing Shelley. The defense, on the other hand, faced an uphill battle. The confession, combined with the overwhelming DNA evidence, left little room to maneuver. They considered challenging the legality of the confession or questioning the reliability of four-decade-old evidence. Yet as the pre-trial hearings unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the facts were damning. The presence of McCurley's DNA at the scene was not merely coincidental, it was incriminating. There was no rational explanation for why his genetic material would be found at the murder site, nor why his story had shifted so many times when confronted. The trial itself was slated to begin in August 2021, and the Nance family braced themselves for what was sure to be an emotionally harrowing experience. Shelley's father, now elderly, had waited more than half his life for this moment. As he took his seat in the courtroom gallery, surrounded by supporters and victims' advocates, he carried with him the memory of his daughter, the bright, kind teenager who had once dreamed of becoming a nurse. He would hear details about her death that had never been publicly disclosed, relive the trauma of that terrible night, and face the man accused of taking her away. The weight of it was nearly unbearable. But just before the trial was set to begin, an unexpected development shifted the course of the case entirely. Glen McCurley entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for pleading guilty to murder, he would avoid a full jury trial and receive a life sentence in prison. For the Nance family, the news was bittersweet. On one hand, it spared them from having to endure a prolonged and graphic trial. On the other, it denied them the public vindication and full narrative that a trial could have offered. Still, the plea meant that McCurley admitted to his crime. For the first time, he publicly acknowledged that he had killed Shelley Nance. During the hearing where the plea was formally entered, the courtroom was silent as the judge asked McCurley if he understood the charges and accepted responsibility. He spoke softly, his voice lacking the emotion or remorse one might expect after confessing to such a heinous act. There were no grand apologies, no explanations of why he had done what he did. In many ways, his confession left more questions than it answered. Why had he targeted Shelley? Was it premeditated or opportunistic? Did he know her beforehand, or was it a random act of violence? McCurley offered no insight, only the hollow affirmation of guilt. As the sentencing was handed down, Shelley's father stood to deliver his victim impact statement. His voice trembled, but he spoke with clarity and conviction. He described the unbearable pain of losing his daughter, the sleepless nights, the holidays forever altered, the ache that had lived in his chest for 40 years. He said Shelley had been kind, smart, and full of promise, a young woman who wanted to help others and had never hurt anyone. He spoke of the moment he learned she was gone, the moment he saw her lifeless body, and the years he spent begging for answers. He looked directly at McCurley and asked the question that had tormented him for decades. Why? McCurley had no answer. Shelley's siblings also gave statements, recalling childhood memories and the hole her absence had left in their lives. They spoke of graduations, weddings, and family gatherings where she was missing. One of her sisters described how she used to sleep with the lights on after Shelley's murder, afraid that the killer might return. Another spoke about how the tragedy had shaped their identity, how they lived in a constant state of fear and distrust because of what happened. The pain was raw, but there was also strength in their voices. They had waited 40 years to say these things, and they would not be silent now. After the sentencing, McCurley was led out of the courtroom in shackles. He would spend the rest of his life in a Texas prison, never again to walk free. For Shelley's family, it was the end of a long and agonizing journey. There would be no true closure. Nothing could bring Shelley back or undo the trauma they had endured, but there was justice. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. The community of Garland responded with a mix of relief and reflection. For older residents, the case had been a lingering wound. Many remembered the summer of 1980, the shock of Shelley's murder, and the fear that rippled through their neighborhoods. Younger residents learned the story anew, realizing that the quiet suburban streets they grew up on had once been stained by violence. Local news outlets covered the resolution extensively, highlighting the perseverance of Shelley's family and the dedication of the cold case detectives who never gave up. But even with the case closed, questions lingered. How had McCurley gone unnoticed for so long? Why did he do it? Was Shelley a random target, or was there something more? Investigators had their theories, but no concrete answers. Some believed he had simply seen her that night, alone and vulnerable, and acted on a predatory impulse. Others suspected he might have seen her before, perhaps in passing, and fixated on her. Regardless of the motive, the cruelty of his actions and the ease with which he returned to a normal life remained deeply unsettling. The haunting truth was this: evil had hidden in plain sight. A man capable of murder had lived quietly among others, raising children, going to work, shopping at the grocery store. And no one had known. For Shelley's family and the people of Garland, that reality was perhaps the most disturbing of all. It shattered the illusion that time and normalcy could guarantee safety. It reminded them that justice can be elusive, but not impossible. As the courthouse emptied and the media cameras were packed away, Shelley's name remained. Not just as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience, perseverance, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Her story, once a forgotten headline, had returned to the forefront. And though her life was taken far too soon, her memory had endured, fueled by love, carried by those who refused to let her be forgotten, and honored by a justice system that, however delayed, finally heard her voice.